everyone's ready, we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Shelby Nelson. I'm the Executive Director here at Clay County Heritage. So thank you guys all for coming today. We do these lunch and learn programs every month on the last Wednesday. They're always at noon. So some of our upcoming ones, in August, we will have Bree Blom from Clay County Conservation here to talk kind of about the natural history of Clay County. And then on September 28th, we'll have Diana Coppin here about memoir writing, and that will be tied into our next temporary exhibit that will be in the South Gallery, which is about Diana's aunt, Mary and Helen, who did a lot of civil rights service. So you can kind of see the exhibit before or after, and then hear Diana speak. So today we're going to be talking about Iowa's statehood. So I kind of have it broken into, I guess, 4 different parts. So we'll talk about Iowa as a territory, and then how it became a state, the process that it had to take for that, and how it grew over time. And we'll talk about some of the boundary and border issues Iowa has had, especially with declaring their borders as a state. There were some issues with that. And then we will also talk about the capital of Iowa and how the town that was the capital has changed and the different buildings that have existed for that. And then we'll talk a little bit about Clay County's development in the terms of counties being established and that kind of thing. So the first thing to talk about is the 1787 Northwest Ordinance. When the Revolutionary War ended, America got a big chunk of land that was east of the Mississippi and south of the Great Lakes from England. So they got this new territory, and because of how they were ruled as colonies, they wanted to make sure they had a strong system in place for how the federal government would manage these territories without them being states. So they set up this Northwest Ordinance, and this was used for Iowa when it became a state. So the rules of this ordinance were that if you had under 5,000 voters, and voters were any free white men, if you had under 5,000, you were ruled by a governor and 3 judges, and those were all appointed by the President of the United States. If you had 5,000 to 60,000, then you became an official territory. You still had the governor and judges that were all appointed by the President. You weren't voting them in yet. But you could elect a representative for Congress, but your representative didn't have any voting power. And then once you hit that 60,000 point, you could apply for statehood, and then you could elect your own officials, and you'd have that voting representation in the federal government. So here we have kind of this section there. The middle part is going to be the Louisiana Purchase. So that was in 1803. Iowa was part of that purchase, and all of the states that came about in that section were all under this ordinance. And for a time, Iowa, the land that would become Iowa, was actually attached and considered part of the Michigan territory. It went up through Wisconsin and Michigan. That was all considered one territory. When Michigan became a state, the land that would become Iowa was part of the Wisconsin territory. And then once Iowa became a territory, that boundary stretched kind of to where the Missouri border is now. And then actually, I do have a better picture. It stretched up to include like where the Twin Cities are now and the part of the Dakotas there. So it was really this big chunk of land. And when it became a state, it decreased a lot. So we became an official territory in 1838. And at that time, we had President Martin Van Buren, and he appointed Robert Lucas as our governor. Population was around 22,000 at that point. And that was kind of an immediate transition. They elected their own representative for Congress. And at that time, Robert Lucas made the capital in Burlington, so that was our first territorial capital. We didn't have an official building at that point. They just kind of met where they could, but that's where the first government was taking place. And then in 1840, so 2 years later, President William Henry appointed John Chambers Under William Henry's guidance, John Chambers moved the capital to Iowa City. And at that point, they again they didn't have an official building. They were just operating kind of wherever they could. So both John Chambers and Robert Lucas, they were pushing for statehood as the numbers increased. They really wanted to get that system in place so when they hit that 60,000, they could apply for statehood and immediately become a state. But the people living in Iowa at that time, all the residents, they didn't want to become a state because of taxes. So once they became a state, their taxes would increase because they would have to pay both state taxes and federal taxes. And because there wasn't a large number of people in Iowa, that meant that they would have to pay a bigger chunk of those taxes. So most of the people actually living in Iowa, they didn't want to become a state until about 4 years later. So in 1844, that's when President James K. Polk was appointed James Clark as our governor. And he is the one who officially made that process going and applying for statehood. People living in Iowa were feeling a lot better. The population was a lot larger, so they felt like they could handle the extra tax burden. There was also a big debate at this time with slavery. Iowa was part of the North, so slavery was illegal. And because of that, they had to time their entrance into statehood with that of a southern state. So in 1845, Florida became a state in March, and so Iowa really felt that pressure to get their statehood application in, so they wouldn't have to wait around for another southern state to apply. And it ended up happening that Texas also became a state in 1945, but in December. So we ended up becoming a state in 1846, a year later. So Texas is technically our sister state that we both entered the United States at the same time. So when they originally applied for statehood, they did have that entire green section, that border all the way to Canada. They applied with those borders. The government said, no, you can't be that big. And a lot of the northern states at that time, their representatives in Congress, they pushed back at that large, at it being that large. They wanted to have the extra land to create more northern states as time went on. They ended up cutting it down to our normal borders. We made a compromise. We became an official state on December 28, 1846, and we were the 29th state. Now, we also had issues with our southern border. So here in this red map, right in the middle, there's that section of yellow. There's a line in there that is the Sullivan line. That is what was believed to be the original boundary line. So in 1816, a man by the name of Colonel John C. Sullivan, he surveyed the area and marked the northern boundary of Missouri because they became a state before Iowa. So he marked their northern boundary, but he didn't do it right. He didn't adjust his compass, so the line was actually angled. So the point on the Mississippi River was 4 miles north of that on the Missouri, so it was slanted. And in Missouri's constitution, they became a state in 1821, but in their constitution, they defined their northern border as the rapids of the River Des Moines, which is super specific. And so as people were moving to Iowa and settling land there, a lot of them wanted to be in Iowa, not Missouri, because Missouri was a southern state, and they didn't want to live in a state that allowed slavery. So they really wanted to be a part of Iowa. Iowa officials had the line being slightly south of the Sullivan line, where they thought the borderline was. So there was this gap of territory that they fought over, essentially. They disputed where the real line was. Missouri's officials sent another surveyor in 1837 to redo this line. He found close to Sullivan's line, but his line was slightly south, And so there was about 2,600 acres that Iowa considered theirs and Missouri also considered their land. And because of that, Missouri wanted to collect taxes. They were a state, so they wanted to collect state taxes from the people living in those 2,500 acres. Iowa was like, no, they're in our territory. They don't have to pay your taxes. And so the governors at that time were Robert Lucas in Iowa, and so he told the Missouri governor that he could not collect taxes from these people. They were part of Iowa's territory, so he could not send his sheriffs to go collect taxes. And despite this warning, the Missouri governor sent his sheriffs anyway, and this became the Honey War. So he sent his sheriffs to collect taxes. Iowa sheriffs ended up arresting Missouri sheriffs that were collecting taxes, which of course, that upset a lot of people in Missouri. And so because Missouri was a state, they did have a militia, a formal army, and so they ended up rounding up their men, and they came to the borderline. Governor Lucas called for volunteers from those living in Iowa because since they were in a state, they didn't have a formal militia. So he asked people to volunteer and meet in the towns along the border. The U.S. Supreme Court ended the boundary issue in 1851, which is right on the brink of before shots were fired, and said that that disputed land was Iowa land. So they sent and resurveyed, and they found Sullivan's line. They corrected it, so they straightened it out. And so all that land became Iowa territory. So we had this Honey War. Nobody was injured or killed or anything like that. It was called the Honey War because very early on, somebody destroyed trees that were filled with valuable honey. They don't say who destroyed them, but that's where the name came from. And when the U.S. Supreme Court resurveyed in 1851 and found this official boundary, they put big cast iron monuments on either side that weighed about 1,600 pounds. And then every mile was a wooden post, and every 10th mile was another solid iron post. So they marked out mile by mile the border so it couldn't be disputed anymore. The issue still came up again in 1896, so 40 years later. The Supreme Court did another survey and found most of the original stone monuments, or replaced the wooden monuments with stone. And you can still find some of these iron and stone monuments along the southern border today. And so this is actually the one on the far right. That is one of the stone monuments that marks the border. And then the other stone is a monument to Sullivan and the service he contributed. And so these are located they're on the west side, kind of right in between the midpoint and the far west side of Iowa. That's where they are on that boundary line. And because this war was kind of ridiculous to the people living in both Missouri and then northern Iowa, people who weren't living in that strip, somebody actually wrote a poem about it shortly after. They believe it was written by a Missouri guy, but it reads, "Ye freedmen of this happy land, which flows with milk and honey, arise, to arms your ponies mount, regard not blood or money. Old Governor Lucas, tiger-like, is prowling round our borders, but Governor Briggs is wide awake, just to listen to his orders. 3 trees stand about the line between our state and Lucas. We ready all these trees to fall and bring these to a focus. We'll show old Lucas how to brag and seize our precious honey. He also claims, I understand, of us 3 bits and money." But this was actually set to the tune of Yankee Doodle. So it was like a little folk song that was around for a while. And then, quite recently, another song was written about the Honey War, and I'll play a little bit of it. But it was written by Jacob Grace. First learned about the Honey War when he was in college. One of his friends was like, hey, have you ever heard about this? We just learned about it in class. And since that moment, he was kind of fascinated by the whole thing. And he is a musician and artist, so he'd been wanting to write a song about it for years. And in 2018, he finally did. And he recorded himself singing the song right by the monuments and border posts I showed. So the song is 8 minutes long. I won't be playing all of it.
You serving that honey roll, well, buddy, so did I. Camped out along the border where they sent us all to die. War between the states way back in 1839. When Missouri and Iowa territory didn't know where to draw the line. Along the border, taxes were a matter of debate. We tell both tax collectors we lived in the other state. All across the Gator Nation, we thought we were living free. Till we heard that tax collector cut down our honey tree. And we were tipping our hats and saying, how do you do? Did you hear about those honey trees? Well, I did too. I never laughed so hard, it's funny, just what some people do. I never laughed so hard, it's funny, just what some people do. But for Iowa Governor Robert Lucas, the dispute was black and white. He just finished licking Michigan and he was looking for a fight. And Missouri Governor Lilliebird Boggs was not one to mess around. He just kicked out the Mormons and he always stood his ground. They both issued proclamations that the nation had their back and mobilized militias to prepare for an attack. And they ordered tax collectors to collect or reassess. And those poor tax collectors had to go and do their best. And we were tipping our hats and saying, how do you do? Did you hear about this honey war? Well, I did too. I never laughed so hard, those governors must not have much to do. I never laughed so hard, those governors must not have much to do.
Alright, so there's some of that. It doesn't have a real name. If you just search Honey War Poem, it should come up. Yep.
These aren't bad.
There aren't a lot of them out there as far as I know.
Doesn't help either.
Yeah, it doesn't have a name. So you would think after 1896 and the Supreme Court's second survey of the line that the dispute was over. It was not. In 2005, the state of Missouri contracted to have the border resurveyed and found many of the markers that the Supreme Court originally put in 1851. So that has since, I assume, been resolved. We'll see in another 50 years if they want like another survey.
Good thing those things.
Yeah. We did also have an issue with our western border, so with the Missouri River. So in 1846, when we became a state, we defined our west border as the middle of the channel of the Missouri River, and then the border ends at the Big Sioux River, which is between Iowa and South Dakota, up in that corner. The problem with that is that the Missouri River was originally actually just a bunch of different streams, not one solid river. So in the winter, some streams would freeze, which caused the other ones to flood over and create new channels. So the river was actually moving. The boundaries were changing over time. So because of this, right now, there's actually a part of Iowa that's in Nebraska on the other side of the river. This is the town of Carter Lake. So they were originally on the Iowa side, but because these streams would freeze and flood and then move, they became an island, and then they became part of Nebraska. The town itself is about 3,500 people. They're not very big. They are surrounded by Omaha. And because of this, Iowa and Nebraska ended up having a tiff over Carter Lake, who they were actually part of because the river was moving, but technically that land was still Iowa. So the Supreme Court actually ruled that Carter Lake was still a part of Iowa in 1892. But as late as 1979, Carter Lake residents had a Nebraska zip code. They picked up their mail in Omaha, and they weren't listed in any Iowa phone books. So over here, we actually, one of these maps is from, I think, 1978, and Carter Lake is not pictured at all. The Missouri River has since been kind of stabilized, so it can't shift like it used to. Those projects began in 1935. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers constructed dams, dikes, levees, everything to keep it from flooding and creating new channels. So it should be safe. We shouldn't be moving any more land over to the Nebraska side or vice versa.
Carter Lake is now in Iowa and Nebraska.
So it's Iowa. It's part of the state of Iowa, but the land itself is on the Nebraska side of the river.
Right next to the airport, right next to the
Yep, right next to the airport. So that kind of covers the territorial part of Iowa. Do you guys have any questions about that section?
Does the border still run down the middle of Missouri?
Yeah.
River?
So technically, yeah, it is the Missouri River. Most maps now kind of scoop to get Carter Lakes, and you can't really tell because it's such a small town that they're doing that, but yeah, that's still our technical boundary in our constitution because that hasn't, our state constitution hasn't changed much since 1846. So. All right, I'm gonna jump into the different Capitol buildings we've had over the years. So the first territorial capital was in Burlington. They didn't have an official building. And when they moved to Iowa City, they also didn't have one for a while. But our first capital is in Iowa City. It's still there today. And that building was built using limestone from a quarry right there in Iowa City. And it was built by the architect John Francis Ragu, who was actually the architect of Springfield, Illinois, their first Capitol building. So if you ever see both, they look pretty similar. They're almost identical. And it was the first building on the hill is where they picked it because it had a beautiful view of the river and the surrounding land. So it was this first building in a large patch of land. It has some unique architecture things in it. Today it still has a lot of the original glass work, so if you go there and look through the glass, it's very wavy, it's not clear to look through. And then they also have their self-supporting reverse spiral staircase. And so most spiral staircases go from left to right. That one goes from right to left, so it trips people up when they walk on it. And it's all, John Francis Ragu did design it to be self-supporting. So it's all built into the stairs. There's no beams or anything with the railings. It's just kind of a staircase floating in the air. The architect did end up leaving the project before it was finished being built. And he supposedly took the blueprints with him. So the construction workers there and the new architect, they just kind of guessed and figured it out. So they did end up building that staircase wrong. And the last step was about twice the size of the other steps. and the railings that weren't measured correctly. So on one side it was about a foot shorter than the railing on the other side.
Oops.
Once it became the University of Iowa's first building, they corrected the railing issue. While it was a state building, they hid it using a water cooler. Essentially, they put something in front of it so no one could see the discrepancy. But like I said, that's still a museum. You can go there today. They actually have an exhibit right now of photographs of the Pentecrest, where the old Capitol Museum is, back in 1850 and now. So they're doing a big contrast. But they're still open. You can see them. Our second building was built when the Capitol moved to Des Moines. So in 1855 is when they kind of decided that, and they moved officially in 1856. But talks of moving the Capitol building to a more central location began as early as 1851. So we were only a state for 5 years, and they're like, we can't stay here because we're growing. So they decided to move to a more central location. And different cities and towns were kind of putting in bids and competing because they wanted to be the capital, because they knew that that meant they would be more wealthy and they would have be a lot more profitable. So the state government sent 3 commissioners out to find a location, and they chose this piece of prairie between the Des Moines and Skunk River in Jasper County. At the time it was called Monroe City. So many people, once they made that recommendation, many people went ahead and just bought land there. Legislature decided not to go with that recommendation, and instead they started looking at places like Oskaloosa, Pella, and Fort Des Moines. Finally, they decided in 1855 to move the capital within the 2-mile junction of the Des Moines and Raccoon River in Polk County, so where it is now. And then they had to decide, well, do we want to be on the east side or the west side of the river? Eventually, they were donated 10 acres on the east side by Wilson Alexander Scott. So he donated those 10 acres, and that's what they used to start. And so he ended up buying, he had a big chunk of land besides those 10 acres. And so east side developers decided, other people who bought land decided to help the government build the building, move stuff. So they ended up building a brick building. They thought it would be kind of temporary. They would go on and build a much larger building. That brick building was actually there for 26 years. But Wilson Alexander Scott ended up footing the bill for a large chunk of that 3-story brick building and the moving costs. They did run into trouble. It was December when they decided to move the capital. And so they had some issues with winter at that time. There weren't any bridges or ways to cross rivers and streams. The roads were just dirt with ruts. It was all wagons still. So a lot of the original furniture has been lost. It was damaged. They left it out in blizzards. It fell into rivers. So there isn't a lot of original furniture from the first Capitol building in Iowa City that didn't make it to Des Moines. They also had to move 4 large safes from Iowa City to Des Moines. One of those safes ended up being left for about a week in just kind of the middle of nowhere because of the blizzard. And once the storm had settled and they were able to get back to it, they put it on a bobsled and finally got it to Des Moines. But it was quite an adventure. So this original brick building, once they built our current Capitol building, they didn't use that brick building anymore. They just let it sit, and it started to fall apart. It eventually burnt down in 1892. So where that brick building used to be is now the Civil War's Soldiers and Sailors Monument. If you were to go to the Capitol and walk around the campus around it, that's where that building used to be. But back to Wilson Alexander Scott, who paid for that building. So yeah, he paid for it, he built it, and he leased it to the government for $1 a year. But he had to borrow a lot of money to foot those bills to build the building and help them move. He planned to earn that back by selling his other pieces of land that were around the Capitol. But at that time, there was an economic depression came about, and his land wasn't as valuable. So he wasn't getting the money he thought he would for it. So then he decided that he was going to open a sawmill out in Gold Country around Pikes Peak in Colorado. While he was traveling to Colorado, he never made it. He ended up getting cholera, and he ended up passing away in Nebraska. So he is actually buried on Capitol Hill. They brought his body back, and he was buried right next to where the Capitol building was because of his influence and how much he helped with that. But they didn't mark that spot until about 1923. The marker is still there. You can still see it. So if you're again ever in Des Moines, that's something you can see there as well. Finally, our third Capitol building, which is the one we still have, that was built, or work began for that in 1871. A lot of people opposed them building it at that time because they thought that brick building was good, it was going to last. They didn't want to pay for this new intricate fancy building that they didn't think they needed. There were also towns and cities that wanted them to move the capital to their part of the state. And then railroad companies also were a big part of this debate because they wanted the capital to be on their line. So there was almost another bidding war of moving this state capital again. They decided against that. A man by the name of John A. Casson, he was a political leader at the time, but he really won people over and talked people into building this new building in the terms of state pride. He said, you know, we needed to have like a jewel of the state that showed how awesome we are, basically. And so he really talked people into doing that. So after he won everybody over, legislature allotted $1.5 million for the building of this new, the third Capitol building. And it was with the understanding that taxes wouldn't be raised to pay for the building. So they had to stick to their $1.5 million budget. They ran into some issues right away. Once they built the basement walls, they realized that the stones that they chose were not the best quality, so they were cracking because of water freezing in them, and the basement was flooding. So they ended up ripping all of those stones out, and despite the cost, they actually got stones from that original quarry in Iowa City that was used for the first Capitol building. They got stones from there to build the Capitol instead of what was local. So that increased their cost as they started building it up and up and up. There were debates about reducing the cost, getting rid of, you know, the domes, getting rid of the gold, not having marble in it, you know, kind of trying to cut those corners. Some people thought that the gold domes especially were just like bad taste, that they were tacky and that we shouldn't do that. So again, people were fighting over what it should look like. They ended up not changing the plans at all. And by the time the building was completed, it cost $2,873,294. And it was all paid for by the time the building was done. And they did not have to raise taxes or borrow money to finish building it. They were able to just do it as they planned, despite the, you know, almost over $1 million increase in the budget. They moved into that building in 1884. Over 30,000 Iowans came for the opening reception of that building to celebrate it. So the outside was done, but not the inside at that point. So they continued doing the interior decoration and final details inside while the government was still functioning in the building. Shortly after the building opened, it actually caught on fire in the House of Representatives wing. And they were supposed to be in session shortly after that, like a week later. So a lot of them were in the building at that point. And so both the governor and other legislators helped put out the fire. And then they were able to use the uncharred part of the building to meet the next week. But that was also quickly fixed and not a big deal. As the state grew, they had to build other state government buildings around the Capitol and move. Some of them were built across the river. So originally they had this 10 acres of land for the Capitol building and any other auxiliary buildings they might need. And now it's 165 acres. So it's much larger. They grew much more than they thought they would. There were some major restorations on both the exterior and interior of the building in 1983. They rebuilt the gold dome. They restored the decorative stonework on the outside and the inside. They replaced windows with modern glass. They also repainted the interior. They are currently actually doing work on the dome again. It was found to not be the most structurally sound, so they are working ways to restabilize it. It was regilded recently as well. It is open for touring. You obviously can't go up in the dome anymore, but you can still walk around. It's all free. And there's all the monuments like the Sailors and Soldiers one and Scott's Grave. So there's still a lot to do there. So any questions about Capitol buildings?
It's just beautiful.
It is. It's beautiful. So I actually worked at the old Capitol Museum, and one of the questions or comments we got a lot was that Iowa was the only state with a gilded dome. That's not true. There was also something like a rumor that people heard that if your state had a golden dome, I believe it had to do with like when your state was founded, but that's not true either. It's just kind of what was fashionable. So we are not the only state with a gold dome. Maybe you knew that, but it was something we heard a lot. Okay, so what does this mean for Clay County? So when counties were being formed, they had to be a certain size in order to become a county. You had to be 432 square miles at a minimum. Clay County is well over that, so that was no issue. And Clay County was actually a part of 45 counties that were created on January 15, 1851. So it was part of this big chunk that at that time the auditor decided those were going to be counties. And that would have been when the capital was in Iowa City. So Clay County, when we were first founded, we actually operated with the government out of Woodbury County. So our judges and officials were coming from there. We didn't hold elections until the fall of 1858. And so that's when we actually really became a county. The land was declared a county, but it didn't start functioning like a county until like 7 years later. And then Clay County is named after Lieutenant Colonel Henry Clay Jr., who was a part of the Mexican War. As the county website says, it is not because of the clay that can be found in the county that was used to make things. It has nothing to do with that. The first elections were held again were organized in 1858 and held in 59. So 14 men were elected to serve on the county board. Our judges were then by district, so we didn't have our own judge. We were still kind of sharing. And when we first became a county, this would have been like in 1851 before elected officials happened. Our county seat was actually Peterson. And then once those 14 officials were elected, they moved the seat to Spencer and quickly got to work building our courthouse that we have today. And that's kind of why Spencer became as established as it is. They wanted to move it a lot earlier than 1859, but because there wasn't a layout for the city quite yet and it wasn't established, everybody said no. So people worked really hard to get Spencer established so that they could move the county seat. Iowa did just celebrate its 175th birthday last year. The State Historical Society did a whole exhibit on this about the last 13,000 years of Iowa history. And so we actually have one of their pop-up displays in our gallery right outside this door. So they sent 275 of these pop-up displays throughout the state, so there is at least one in every county. And they have all kinds of things online, different videos you can watch that they did with this. I believe the exhibit is still up as well, so again, if you go to the one, you can see that. we don't really have time. I do have a quick video that I can show later, but if there's any questions, I'll take those. I'll also say over here, our objects for today are two different maps of Iowa. So here on the left in the black frame shows the Iowa territory. It's actually highlighting the Arkansas one, but we are outlined in green with the Iowa territory. And then the other map is kind of a pictorial map of Iowa that has different images and history about the different towns and counties and that kind of thing. So it's got a lot of text on it, but it's pretty cool to look at. Again, Carter Lake is on neither of them. So you can come up here and take a close look at those, or I can put them on a table as well. Otherwise, that's it for today.
Enjoyed it.
There are note cards on the table. So if you could, on one side, actually finish the phrase, "My community shares blank." You can put a word, a couple words, whatever you want in that blank. But my community shares what? I've been putting together a little graphic of different things people have said throughout the year. So it's been kind of cool to see the same things and the different things people have said as well.